Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Political Excess. It's now been a week since the midterms have concluded, so let's take a minute here and see where things stand. Well, overall, it was not a good night for the Republicans, that is for sure. They did terrible in the governor's department, they did terrible in the Senate, and in the House, they vastly underperformed. And over a week later, we are still counting ballots in some of these races. I find that to be distasteful. I know a lot of people think it's unacceptable, but here we are, and on New York Times, it shows the Republicans at 217 seats. By the time this video posts, they may very well have the majority clinched, but they're really only expected to win the House by a couple of vote margin, which is seriously under what the expectations were, as most people thought they would probably win 20 to 25 seats. That's what I thought. Some people had them winning over 30 seats. The low end was probably them winning about 10 seats, but this was a fairly significant disappointment for the Republicans. We are still waiting on the final results and the final popular vote totals, but there were a few bright spots for the Republicans. It wasn't bad across the board. They had a great night in Florida. They had a good night in New York. California doesn't seem to be too terrible. Texas was fine. But in a lot of states, there were a lot of close races, and Republicans did not pick up seats they were expected to, or they even lost seats in other places like Washington. But the Rust Belt was not a good night for the Republicans. New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, they either came up short or lost ground in these states. And if we take a look at the Senate, well, we know that was a major disappointment for the Republicans, and the Democrats got almost everything they could have hoped for. Yes, there will be a runoff in Georgia. Yes, we're waiting for the final ranked choice results in Alaska. But the Republicans came up just short in some other states, such as Nevada. If we take a look at the vote shifts from the 2020 presidential election, this shows us that the shifts are completely all over the place. As I said, down in Florida, that was a fantastic night for the Republicans. There's a ton of red arrows here in Alabama, even a lot of Georgia, South Carolina, eastern North Carolina, even other states such as South Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana. Those had trends toward the right. Kansas clearly shifted toward the right, even though it reelected Laura Kelly, the Democrat. And over in the Northeast, Connecticut went toward the right. And in New York, that was a nice night for the Republicans. They did end up flipping some seats there in the U.S. House. But these Senate margins that trended toward the left, we're talking about Pennsylvania, Ohio, even Kentucky, Missouri, Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona. So there are some bright spots for Republicans. It's not a complete wipeout. In fact, if we remember back in 2018, that was a big blue wave. Democrats won 40 seats in the House. However, we might forget that Republicans actually flipped 4 seats in the U.S. Senate and ended up with a net gain of 2 in that big blue wave. So what Republicans did in the Senate there really counters the narrative of a big blue wave, because that big blue wave was mostly only in the House and for governors. And this year, it looks like for governors, Republicans only picked up Nevada. Probably the biggest disappointment, I would think, out of all of this, even if they only narrowly win the House. They thought for sure they were going to get maybe 2 or 3 more governorships, and they came up short. And what about the state legislators? Well, Republicans mostly had a bad night in that scenario as well. I'll pull up this Ballotpedia page, and you could shift through the tables here to see exactly what's changed. Republicans maintained control in some state houses, but perhaps the most notable one here is the Michigan State House and State Senate has flipped toward the Democrats. Republicans did make gains in Iowa, Kentucky, and West Virginia. One other positive aspect for the Republicans is the state Supreme Court elections in North Carolina, where they flipped 2 seats from the Democrats and now have a 5-2 majority there. And in Ohio, Republicans were able to win that Supreme Court election there as well. Those victories might be enough for a new congressional map to withstand the state courts, and that could help Republicans in the U.S. House in just a couple of years. But no matter how you spin it, it's hard to say Republicans did not have a disappointing night at best across the board in all of these different categories. A lot of their ballot measures were defeated. A lot of their candidates in statewide offices other than governor were defeated. There's definitely some positive signs, but overall, the finger pointing has already begun. A lot of people are blaming Mitch McConnell. A lot of people are blaming Donald Trump. If you're a Democrat, you probably could not ask for a better scenario to have infighting on the Republican side going into the beginning of a presidential election. So we'll see what happens, but this is probably the high point for the Democrats. They're going to face a tough U.S. Senate map in 2 years. But a lot of people might want to know where the Republicans went wrong. How did the polls seemingly be off so much? Well, we could say the same thing in 2016 when we thought Donald Trump was pretty much going to have no chance, but he ended up pulling out, and those polls were wrong. So I will close by pulling up the CNN exit polling and providing some final thoughts on mail-in balloting. Now, first off, these exit polls, you can look through all the details if you'd like, but I've read that exit polling is really only conducted on Election Day, and mail-in balloting and early voting is factored in a different way to exit polls, if at all. My understanding on that is it's harder to do when it's not on Election Day. So if that is the case, it's really going to be hard to put a lot of weight on these exit polls here. And of course, I think candidate equality does matter. I think if you are against the establishment on both sides, you're going to be smeared and tarnished, and it's going to be an extremely uphill battle for you. And Republicans did have more candidates that were against the establishment, and some of those candidates were problematic. Some of it I'm sure is fair, and some of it I'm sure is overblown. So those people are not allowed to get into power and challenge the establishment from the inside. But I do think the main deciding factor is with mail-in balloting. I know a couple states did do it prior to COVID. So up until 2018, everything was just fine as far as Election Day and mail-in balloting. But now with COVID having changed a lot of election rules and a lot of states wanting to make it permanent, I think it is legitimate to have questions or concerns about mass mail-in balloting. Now, I know if you're a Democrat, you're probably going to scoff at the idea of questioning the integrity of mail-in balloting whatsoever, and I understand that because when you win a race, you really don't want to have anybody questioning how you won, you just want to take the win. But when ballots take days or weeks to count, and when more and more ballots are accepted if they come in after Election Day, and most of those times they tip in favor of the Democrats and against the Republicans, and when all of this is pretty much new given COVID, I think it is very fair to have questions about the integrity of the system if we want to have confidence in the way our elections are conducted. Taking days or weeks to count, that's unacceptable. Nobody could feel confident about that. Nobody could feel good about that. For years, I always remember on Election Day, we know who won. Once in a while, there's an extremely close race, but there's not a trickle in of additional ballots. And my perspective on this is we're not supposed to be allowed to question this, but I think any rational person would want to question it when we're not voting in person, giving the opportunity for so many different points of conflict. In theory, everything should be able to be verified with strict scrutiny on signatures. However, we often hear about ballot curing as there's mistakes, there's dates missing. So then there's a whole nother layer of a process where we have people try to fix their ballots. That's all an extreme turnoff for me. That's so far from what we were doing, getting the results on Election Day from in-person voting. Early in-person voting seems fine to me, because if you have someone there in person, there's really nothing that can go wrong. Once we are sure we know who the person is, they're going to have their ballot recorded right then and there. There's no extra steps in between, and that to me is highly secure. I do agree voter ID is not really all that much of a burden. Other countries do it. A lot of people think it's not asking too much, so that does make sense to me. But mass mailing out ballots, to me that's just asking for there to be points of contention. And a lot of times we might not even be able to know if there is anything going wrong. When you vote in person, it's just you in the booth, you have your privacy, there's no intimidation, there's no pressure, you get to vote in secret. But now if people are getting ballots mailed to them, there's absolutely no telling if there was any pressure or coercion or any intimidation for filling out ballots. We don't know how signatures were obtained, and then we have to trust the postal system. There's just a number of things that I think objectively are going to lower the integrity. Even if you do think the system is overall secure, it's undeniably going to be less secure than voting in person. And then, of course, there's plenty of stories, some of them anecdotal, where ballots were found dumped here, or they were dumped there. Duplicate ballots were printed out and mailed. Non-citizens receiving ballots, dead people receiving ballots. Even if those votes are not counted, there's no chance that's going to instill any confidence in anybody. It really is a long way away from voting in person, where you had to put just a little bit of effort to go in and cast your vote. I think some early voting in person, that's just fine. I think absentee balloting, if you're overseas, or if you're physically unable to go vote, that's fine. Of course, as long as we know for sure who the person is, and we can verify it, and those people are free from intimidation or any outside pressures of who to vote for. So again, I do think this is one of the things that you're not really supposed to be talking about. But I think there are some things that should be changed, especially if we want the vast majority of the population to actually feel like their vote is being counted and that it's not being submerged by other votes a week after the election. We've got to count the votes on election day. We have to know who people are. So the system we have now is probably one that is not really helping out Republicans whatsoever, as they seem to have lost a lot of races by really small margins. And I think even if they win these races, they should still advocate for the election integrity that they want. Do hand recounts, do audits even if you win. It might seem weird to ask for that, but that's what you got to do if you're really all about the integrity. And I think Democrats should be open to understanding how there's many more points of conflict or potential conflict with mass mail-in balloting. It's not really all about blatant fraud. It's about irregularities, it's about errors, and it's about suspicions of outside influence when you're casting your ballot. There's a lot of things that can be discussed. And I think every time just saying that these are the most secure elections ever, I don't think that's doing anyone a service, especially when there's a lot of stories, some of it anecdotal, to the contrary. So anyway, that is a recap of this election, some of my thoughts on the different races and on mail-in balloting, and where the Republicans are going to have to turn it around if they actually want to start winning again. But it's tough to say what's going to happen. There's a lot of things that we can't predict. So who knows what's going to be next? But I do try to look at multiple perspectives. And I hope you do as well. So let me know in the comments any of your thoughts about these midterms, or if you have any thoughts about my commentary on mail-in balloting, let me know down below. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, follow me on Twitter. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.